Hi, I'm Josh, and can I just talk about the fact that you chose to click on this video and to spend this moment with me and just how very wonderful and special that is to me. Thank you so much for being here. And I am going to talk today about Guns of the Dawn by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This will be a completely spoiler-free review. And right off the bat, I'm going to tell you the most important thing you need to know about this book, and then I'm going to tell you to skip most of this video. So, first of all, the reading order. I would highly recommend, if you pick up this book, to start at the beginning of chapter 2. Read chapters 2 through 11, then go back and read chapter 1, and then go back to chapter 12 and read chapter 12 to the end of the book. Now, the reason I'm saying this is, you know how most good authors will, right from the very beginning, sort of drop the reader in the middle of the story, in the midst of something interesting that's happening, to hook the reader in, and then as the story progresses, they'll cleverly go back and kind of fill in the backstory as we move forward in the story. So, what seems to have happened with this book is the author wrote the book and then said, all right, what is some action that I can start off at the beginning of the book? And they said, well, if I move one of the chapters from later in the book and plunk it at the beginning, then there we go. We're in the middle of some action, and then the real story begins after that, and we progress kind of chronologically after that. The problem is, it's very clear that no changes were made to this chapter that got plucked out of the middle and put at the beginning, because if you do what I recommend and start at chapter 2, read 2 to 11, then 1, then 12 onwards, the end of chapter 11 immediately goes into what is now chapter 1, and then the end of chapter 1, and then to chapter 12, it's continues on in sort of a very logical and consecutive manner, and there's nothing there that kind of ties this chapter into the story, and it's very weird how it's done. Like, it's to the point where when I actually got to the end of chapter 11, I had to go back and reread chapter 1 to remind myself, okay, what was it that was supposed to happen here before the next chapter continues? And then when I reread that first chapter, it all made much more sense than when I had read it at the very beginning of the book, because I knew the context, I knew who the characters were, and I knew what was going on, which is not what I knew when I read chapter 1 without having known anything about the story. So it's very clumsily done in terms of how the book was constructed, and this is just the first of many complaints that I have about the writing of the book from a technical point of view. And so here's where I'll say that if you are not a writer or an aspiring writer, seriously, just skip that whole part about the writing and just go to sort of the end of the review when I talk about the stuff that I enjoyed about the book, because I am going to ruin reading experiences for you if you are not a writer. All you're going to see when you read future books, and maybe even this one, is all the little mistakes that less good writers tend to make. And as it did with this book, it certainly distracted me a lot and diminished my enjoyment of the book. However, despite all the complaints I have about the writing, there was enough of an interesting story in here for me to ultimately enjoy the book. Exactly how much I enjoyed it, I'll talk about at the end when I get to my rating. But seriously, if you don't have any plans to be a writer, don't ruin your future reading experiences by watching my technical analysis of the writing here. And I do divide my video up into chapters, so it will be easy for you to skip that. All right, you know the important stuff. Now let's actually dive into my review. Just before I dive into how the book is written, let me just do a very, very brief plot synopsis. As you know, if you watch my reviews, I really don't like to talk about the plot very much at all, because I always personally like going into a book knowing as little as possible and discovering as I go. So, essentially, Guns of the Dawn is a flintlock fantasy it is a fantasy story that happens not in our kind of typical European Middle Ages setting. Rather, it is more a kind of 18th century setting. There's gunpowder, think kind of Napoleonic era. And our main character is sort of an upper class woman, comes from a kind of wealthier family, and we enter the story at a point where war is breaking out between her nation and a neighboring nation. So ultimately, this is a story of war. Our main character does become involved in the war. She actually becomes a soldier and becomes an active participant in the fighting that is happening. And that's not a spoiler. We learn that immediately from diving into that first chapter that is out of place because it should be further on in the book. But our main character picks up the musket and joins the army, and pretty much most of the book it follows her as she participates in this war. So it is a story of war. It's a story of how war affects nations and societies. And while it is very much a military fantasy with a lot of combat and sort of violent action, there is a lot of other interesting stuff going on too in terms of the interactions between characters and the themes that the book is covering, which I'll get into later. I'm going to start out here with a deep dive into the technical aspects of the writing. And let me say, I was surprised that this book was so poorly written, because Adrian Tchaikovsky is a very accomplished and prolific writer. In looking him up on Goodreads, I noticed that he has 9 series that he's written, with a total of 30 books across those 9 series, and that's not including the standalones like this particular novel. And he's written across multiple genres. He's certainly very well known in both the fantasy and the sci-fi genres. So he's published dozens of books, and that left me so puzzled as to why the writing is so bad. I looked up to see if Guns of the Dawn was maybe one of his first books that he ever wrote, but no, it was published in 2015, so it's relatively recent. And then I thought, well, is Adrian Tchaikovsky not a native English speaker? Is this maybe a translation? Especially since I noticed that Tchaikovsky has been changed to a more anglicized version of the spelling of the last name than his actual Polish spelling of his real last name. So I thought, oh, maybe he's a Polish writer and it's been translated. But no, when I looked him up on Wikipedia, it turns out he was born in England. So I really can't explain why at this point in his career this stuff would even get by an editor. Then that gets me to my other point, which is that you have me, who has published nothing, criticizing an author who has published dozens of novels across multiple genres. So take my criticism with a grain of salt. Yes, I have educated myself over the years on how to write well, because that is something that interests me. But don't just take my word for it. As I go through these points, definitely look up for yourself to see if these are valid points I'm making, and to see if this really is poorly written, or if it's me being too critical and stepping into an area where I have no business being. So yeah, definitely do your own research if writing interests you, but let's get right into it. The first thing, from a technical point of view, is when you have characters who are talking to each other with dialogue. Use the dialogue tag said in almost all cases. He said, she said, or for non-binary characters, they said. Only use other dialogue tags if it's very, very important for the reader to know exactly how something was said. Here's how not to do it. I wrote down several examples from the book, and I'll just quickly read through these, and you can get an idea of why it does not sound good from a reader perspective. So, here are just a bunch of quick sentences from the book. "I'll be all right," Roderick promised her. "You know why I am here," she reminded him. "What do you want me to say, Miss Marshwick?" "That my brother need not go for a soldier," she declared outright. "That sounds like a sure recipe for injury," Emily decided. "Miss?" "Soldier-at-Arms Penny Belchier of the Royal Messenger Corps at your service, Miss Marshwick," the girl informed her with a sharp salute. "Don't keep us in suspense, Alice," Emily remonstrated. "Don't be ridiculous," Emily told her. "Mary says that the honor of our family is about looking after those that depend on us," Emily pointed out. "Has he been waiting long?" "Best part of 2 hours," Grant confirmed. So, do you have family back home? I don't even have a back home, Elise revealed. Sergeant, she began. He turned and eyed her. Something I can do for you, Ensign? Sergeant Powwide, she named him. I bought myself a lieutenancy when they were going cheap for volunteers, Tubal recalled. You must be forgetting the colonel's orders, she got out. Get down, Malin's voice came to them. Caxton, how many of our lot made it? 22, counting you and me, the ensign supplied. War makes monsters of us all, she observed. You keep away from me, she warned. No duty I ever signed up for, she spat at him. No man here has authority over me but the king, he panted out. Now, don't you do anything foolish, Tubal, she warned him. I know, he said softly. I'll take care. Besides, Emily here's the one for doing mad things. Me? Emily demanded. He's got you right there, Brocky agreed. Scavian, is it? He snapped out. So, you're one of little Giles' playfellows, he snapped out. No, that's not an error. The author wrote snapped out twice. So, you can see that in literally all of those cases, putting he said, Emily said, she said, Brocky said, you don't need to get fancy, and it starts to sound absolutely ridiculous and absurd. Now you can make this situation even worse by adding adverbs. Adverbs are the devil when it comes to writing. Do not use adverbs except in the most dire of situations, especially when you're tacking them on to dialogue tags that aren't said, or I should say just dialogue tags in general. Leave out the adverbs. And once again, I have several examples that I pulled from the book to see how it actually sounds. He knows I am his servant, Mr. Northway declared smoothly. I am hoping that Alice can now enlighten all of us, Emily said meaningfully. I can't imagine why he would do such a thing, Mary said uncertainly, with the war to occupy his time. It's awkward throwing that in the middle of the sentence, too. Yes, of course, Alice agreed readily. We have always managed, Emily tried weakly. Tried plus weakly. I don't know what could have happened to you, Alice retorted hotly. Let her say what she will, Emily retorted sternly. No, Alice, Emily snapped firmly. No, Sergeant, she said resignedly. War does that, observed Brocky sagely. Anointed for 1 day or 100 years, I am a king's wizard, said Scavian reasonably. They're having to deal with a reversed world, Emily said thoughtfully. If anyone can get us through this, you can, added Caxton loyally. Good luck, she wished him desperately. Let your men and mine retire to some distance where they are less danger both to us and to each other, and I will speak candidly to you. Candidly? She queried cautiously. You are each of you born into a noble house, the king addressed them seriously. What you're doing by adding all these adverbs is you are assuming that your readers are dumb, that they can't draw context from how things are being said or from the way things are being written. It's just so awkward. And that kind of takes me on to my next point, which is to show, don't tell. Readers are intelligent people. People are smart. They will understand what's going on in a well-written story. You don't need to over-explain, and it's always better to show as opposed to telling. And here's just 2 quick examples of what I mean by show, don't tell. And these are just things that had not come up previously in the story, but the author just decides to make the statement for whatever reason, kind of out of nowhere. One character says, "Can you pick up their trail, Grant?" He never really smiled much, but there was grim humor in his gaze now. "Oh, there's precious little I can't track after 20 years on the estate, man." So in that case, instead of just out of nowhere saying that he never really smiled much, and so it's weird that he would have some kind of humor on his face at this point, maybe instead, write the character in such a way that we know that he's a serious character and that this might be out of character for this character. Speaking of bad writing. Here's another example. She glanced at Tubal to see if he was making fun of her. He had always possessed a quietly wicked sense of humor. No lie, he assured her, and then he goes on speaking. So, again, that's just one of those things where we've had no previous indication that he had always possessed a quietly wicked sense of humor. Maybe that's something you just need to build up in the story previously so that we know that, and you don't have to just all of a sudden mention this point that has little to do with anything else. Here's another example too, tied in with what I'm talking about, where there's some over-explaining going on, where it's obvious to the reader from the context of what's going on. And let me just get into it to show you. A character is speaking to another character and says, "Only if you absolve me from putting shillings in the jar. This would bankrupt me else." He maintained his smile with some effort. The shillings, Emily had gathered, were the penalty for serious talk. That's the part that it's like, duh, we already inferred that from what was previously written. And then it continues. There was a moment's hesitation before Brocky nodded, wordlessly indicating that Scavian should continue. The warlock toyed with his emptied glass, the cheer sloughing off him. He had no rank formally, but the touch of the king meant he was the king's own presence out here. Emily understood that he was as good a man as a company captain, whilst the senior Justin Lascari was on par with Colonel Resnick himself. Again, another example of an explanation happening that we can figure out ourselves as the reader. This next point is just a big pet peeve for me in general, and that is when characters in stories seem to be able to read so much just by looking into another character's eyes or looking at the expression on their face. They can look at them and know exactly what they're thinking, and it's such a pet peeve of mine. And here's a few examples where it happens so you can see what I mean. Actually, this first little passage here has two instances of this back to back, as you'll see here. Emily looked him right in the face, a face that had been pared down by the trials of his life until it was too transparent to hide the truth. "You would never give us back alive," she told him. "You had Alice kidnapped for revenge. You hate my family too much. I hear it in your every word." His face froze up, except for his eyes, which flicked towards her musket. "And," Grant added, without looking round, "if your man there moves another step, I'm firing this thing, and that's the end of it." Emily became aware now that Griff had been inching towards her as soon as her musket had focused on the Geyer, and that he was abruptly stock still and scowling. The expression on the face of the Geyer remained calm, but his eyes were as wild as the trapped animals. "He knows I'm right." Emily could almost hear the echo of the shots resounding back to her from some point in time just moments away. Another example here. She looked at his face again and saw that he was frightened for her and had no way to say it, but his eyes spoke it clearly enough. Next one. So once again, two characters are speaking. The first says, "Let me into the Lascan mind. Let me understand you." The other character replies, "I thought you already did," she said, almost goading. "You know we're all war-mad killers, don't you? That we bring our children up on blood and bone meal? Surely you've heard all that." She looked about her at the soldiers within earshot and was a little shocked to recognize belief in some of their faces. What kind of a facial expression is belief? I don't really know. And just one final example. So once again, two characters are together. "Is it?" She did not quite voice the question. Malin's glance at her was shadowed, secret. More magic in this world than the king's, it seemed to say. That's what you got from a glance, that this person is telling you that there's more magic in the world than the king's? I don't know, is that lazy writing or is that just a pet peeve? Let me know if it bothers you when characters seem to be able to read so many detailed things from looking into eyes of other characters. The next bit of bad writing I'm going to talk about are the author's really puzzling use of similes. And I'll just get straight into some examples instead of trying to explain, because you'll see what I mean. So here's the first one. "A blur of thoughts, like a flurry of bird wings, passed across her mind." I'm not sure how a bunch of thoughts and a flurry of bird wings are related, but that's what it says there. "Emily felt pinned by their inexplicable regard, like a moth under glass." I guess that one kind of makes sense if somebody's looking at you and you're feeling a little awkward about it. But here's the next one. "She felt firm fingers touching about her face, outlining dull pains that arose within the darkness of her head like red and purple flowers, bruises." So here we're comparing dull pains in her head to red and purple flowers. All right, next one. "Emily had stood at the barricade, and the knowledge that she would likely meet another dawn had broken on her like the dawn itself." So here, the dawn is being compared to the dawn. Wow, mind-blowing. Next one. This morning she lay in bed, watching the sun creep through the shutters piece by piece like an army escorted by its scouts. So the sun coming in her window is like an army, but not just an army that is being escorted by scouts. Okay, here is the very worst one. I saved it to last for you. Ready for this one? The heat rode on her shoulders like a fat man. I got no words. Let's just leave the similes and get into some more awkwardness. These are either kind of awkward phrases or just things in general that felt a bit awkward. And the first one here is, she studied his features, recalling the smooth and charming man her childhood recalled to her memory. Recalling the smooth and charming man her childhood recalled to her memory. That's very awkwardly stated. It's really windy outside today. It's probably going to affect the audio of this video, so sorry about that. Next one. She was a bold, brassy woman, unashamed of her past or her future. Okay, unashamed of her past, sure, but she's not yet ashamed of her future? Okay. Next one. She had no more questions to usefully ask. Did she have any questions to unusefully ask? Oh, this one's pretty terrible. I gotta read it from the book. They're in the middle of a battle, and we start off with a character yelling, "Up, up," a voice was shouting, "Up and charge them before they reload!" And then, because of italics, we see that the character's thinking to herself, "Preposterous! They have time enough twice over." But she was on her feet and running forwards, heedless of the rest, and only then did she realize that the voice had been her own. She was yelling instructions to the soldiers around her, and it took her a minute to realize that she was saying stuff. This is the thing you commonly see, at least I've come across quite a bit, where a character might be screaming and then they only then realize that the screaming was coming from them or whatever. But to actually be saying full sentences and yelling out instructions without realizing that it's you that's saying them, that's taking it a kind of a step far, I think. And then the final couple of sort of awkward things are, we have some people in the book who are indigenous people, who are indigenous to the land where a certain war is happening, and they are described as beastly little creatures, which is not real cool. And then along similar lines, what minimal amount of humor is kind of sprinkled throughout this war story is fat humor. It's fat characters, I guess, being mocked or having things related to their heaviness being done that are supposed to be funny, and it definitely doesn't go down well. All right, the next point is a real quick one in terms of my writing complaints, and that is the naming of characters. So here are 4 of the military officers that are in the book. We have Sharky, Malarkey, Malin, and Gallon. And somehow we're supposed to remember who's who and keep them apart from each other when they all have such similar names. And the final bit of bad writing here is definitely a failure of the editor as well. So we have 2 characters who are being presented as 2 of the primary villains in this story. And in both of their cases, they literally out of nowhere just start acting like complete a-holes towards our main character, just so that we can have some villains to deal with. And there's no preceding context in terms of things that would cause this kind of behavior from our villain characters. It just felt like the story needed some villains, so we're just going to have a couple of people who are going to have literal murderous intent towards our wonderfully kind main character here for literally no reason. The worst part of that, of the 2 that I've mentioned here, there is one character, and again, I'm not going to spoil things by naming people, but this character just suddenly appears in the middle of the book, and this character's first thing is to just walk up to our main character, and just start being a complete dick. And we've never met this character before. We're halfway through the book. This character just shows up on the scene, walks up to our main character, starts being a complete a-hole. This creates conflict, obviously, with our main character. There's some stuff that happens, and then that storyline is abruptly dropped, and that character is not mentioned for the remainder of the book. That entire character could have been edited out of the story, and literally nothing about the story would have changed. Again, I'm not going to spoil anything, but let me just show you how this character arrives on the scene. We're on chapter 15, page 283, and the first sentence in the chapter is dialogue. "Hoy, ensign!" Emily looked up from her bowl of gruel to see a big bald-headed man approaching her, his uniform jacket opened to the late spring heat. "What is it?" she asked, tacking on "Master Sergeant" as soon as she recognized the 3 crowns on his sleeve. Now she knew him, and then it names him and goes on to explain who he is, because we have never met this character prior to chapter 15 here, and he will very shortly disappear from the story as suddenly as he appeared in it. So it's definitely not all on the author. The editor needs to kind of step in here and take care of a lot of these problems. So let's finally leave behind all this stuff related to the writing, and let's talk about the interesting points that came up as I was reading and some of the interesting themes that the book covers. Because like I alluded to early on, even though the writing did distract me and affect my enjoyment of the story, there was a lot of interesting stuff going on. In terms of the narrative itself, the story that is being told, that is the part that was very well written. So we have a good story with interesting characters and interesting themes that unfortunately is marred by poor writing from a technical point of view. But before I do go on to talk about the positive things, I want to send out a very big thank you to my Patreon supporters, to Joanna, Paul, Osmandas Purvect. Your support, of course, is such an important thing to me. I value it so much, and I am so very grateful, so thank you for that. But like I said, first and foremost, this is a book about war, and here is one statement that's made about war. One of the higher ranking officers is talking to one of the soldiers, and he says, "It's war, ensign. A fool's excuse for killing, but it's a fool's world. Makes fools of all of us." And then in terms of how the war is presented to the population and the propaganda that is used to convince the people that war is necessary, we have this interesting statement. Once again, a higher ranking officer is talking to the soldier and says, "But the thing is, dear girl, you can hardly just write home and tell everyone what a miserable time you're having, you see." "Why not, sir?" "Well, it's morale. Morale, you see. I'm sure everyone back home is distressed enough, what with having so many fine women such as yourself go off to war." They don't want to hear how awful things can get. They want to hear how well we're doing. They need their spirits kept up. "My family would like to hear the truth, Colonel." His smile was maddening, unthinkingly patronizing. "You may think so, but, really, people just want to be comforted. Honestly, you wouldn't want to be unduly worried if you were back home. You wouldn't want to frighten people." And then the character thinks to herself, "I want them to worry because my situation is worrying. I want them to fear because my plight is fearful." But then she says, "Colonel, please." "I'm sorry, Miss Marshwick, but it really is for the best. Write them something nice and reassuring. It is for the best, believe me." And here's another point that goes hand in hand with that one. Two soldiers are talking to each other about the motivations of war. One soldier says, "You'll see me leading my men out as usual the next time they send us," Tubal replied. "But that doesn't mean I have to think war's a good idea." "Surely they have to realize they're wrong, though, in the end. They have to know that we're in the right, defending our homes," Emily insisted. "The people up above us love to lie, and people down here love to be lied to," Brocky said reflectively. "There's many a way of telling someone he's doing the right thing." And I think when it comes to war, propaganda, politics in general, people seem to like to hear what comforts them as opposed to hear the truth about things. Now, these next few quotes get into sort of the nitty-gritty of being a soldier. Here we're following a group of recruits who are in training in preparation to being sent off to the war. And it says they were split into classes of 40 or so and put to work learning their geography and history, their ranks and uniforms, taking care of kit, basic medicine, and the elegant business of taking a life with a gun. There's a sentence that's well written. The elegant business of taking a life with a gun. And then this, about the common soldier. The character is speaking and says, I have spoken to the enemy, Kristen. Soldiers are the same everywhere, I think. Weary, dutiful, and unhappy. One thing I really liked about this book was how it touches on the idea of soldiers who are coming back to society, and in terms of their wounds, their PTSD, the disabilities that they are coming back with, and how society is not prepared to support them, nor are the leaders that sent them off to war to begin with, which is still a problem in our modern society. And of course, I feel a strong personal connection with that as somebody who worked for 16 years as a paramedic and who ultimately ended up on disability due to PTSD and Crohn's disease. And the fact that I've sort of struggled then to get by ever since then in a society where I am no longer valued. So anyways, this passage is talking about the people who are left back in society while the war is going on, and these people are at a market, and it said they were mostly women, those who tried to sell as well as those who picked over it all and did not buy, women and old men, and in amongst them were the veterans. These were the worst examples she knew, men who would not die and could not be returned to the fighting. The new hospitals were ruthless in sending men back to the war if they could serve in any way at all. Here were men who could not march, who could not hold a gun, who could not see the enemy. They passed through the thinning crowd with their awkward, arrhythmic gaits, each man moving to a different drummer. Alice's expression was one of nervous revulsion. Mary would probably have been frightened if she were here, seeing in these men her husband or her brother. Emily herself was surprised to find that they made her angry. Then I'll skip a little bit, and one of the characters says, in reference to one of the sort of governmental leaders named Northway, she says, I know, Alice agreed, misreading her reaction. Why doesn't Northway do something about all this? If these men are in need of help, he could deal with it. Isn't that what he's for? Why have them all out in plain sight? Emily knew she should reproach Alice over that, but the girl had dangled some attractive bait before her. Why wasn't Mr. Northway providing aid to the veterans? The obvious answer was that it would cost money, and he surely coveted every penny the crown gifted him with, and squirreled as much of it away for his own use as he could. And so these brave, damaged men must hobble and beg. And then tying right in with that, we have this. We have a young soldier who is at a function and has sort of come across an older man who is a veteran of a previous war. And the young soldier says, My lord, is something wrong? I did not mean to intrude. His tension-drawn face essayed a smile, which made him look infinitely older and more fragile. I came away from it all, the music and the crowds, because I cannot live amongst such things any more. I am unfit for company, young lady. I have been at war such a long time. One can only witness so many terrible things before one becomes unsuited for polite society. She saw he was trembling like a child. My lord, will you sit? Gratefully, he folded himself into a chair, tilting his head back until it touched the flat of an axe blade hanging behind him. I wish you had not seen me like this, young lady. I have spells where it all comes back to me, the fighting and the war, and then I must leave them all. I am not safe company in those moments. I see the enemy, then... So yeah, so very relatable to me and my PTSD and my inability to be amongst other people. And then next we get into the idea of officers having charge over the lives of sort of the common soldiers below them. And once again, that is so directly relatable to my experiences as a paramedic, especially as an advanced care paramedic who is in charge of everything related to the medical care of a patient and keeping people alive and that sort of thing. So we have two quick quotes for that. This was what it was like to have responsibility for the lives of others. There was no greater burden. And in contrast to that, we have a character who says, looks like you've got command, ensign. She grinned with the easy grin of a woman who doesn't have to be responsible for what is happening. And then, of course, when you are responsible for the lives of others and it doesn't work out, that's kind of where the PTSD component sort of comes in. a few more things I can relate to here. This next one is talking about lawyers, and again, here's a direct connection. We have a character who is a healer, who I can relate to as a paramedic, talking about lawyers, something that I can relate to after the past couple years of dealing with separation and divorce and paying thousands of dollars to a lawyer, even though it was a totally amicable process. So he's talking about a lady that he loved and says, "Broke my heart, she did. Poor old Brocky, eh? Went off as some fellow of a lawyer, she did. Some wordy weasel from the courts. She always did love a professional man, and I was only a dispenser. I could brew a poison or cure the plague, but he could argue the toss before a judge, and so they showered gold upon him. I ask you, what kind of a world is it where men of such slight merit—" Oh, well, a monstrous sigh welled up inside him. And I'll close up with just a couple more quotes that I can, once again, relate to all too well. Emily had stood at the barricade, and the knowledge that she would likely meet another dawn had broken on her like the dawn itself. Am I alive? I am alive. It was as though the hour of her death had come and gone, and the grim spectre himself was overdue. I've had a couple of close brushes with death myself, and sometimes wonder if I've actually survived those or not. Or maybe I've just ended up like this last description here. Coral. She remembered once learning how sea corals grew, how they built shells upon shells to protect themselves, growth after growth of hard armor, until the creatures that had started the mound suffocated and died deep within, and it was the outer shell only that survived. She was like that. The war had calloused her all over, had given her tough armor to wear against its blows, both physical and mental, and now that she came to take the armor off, she found it hollow and empty. Very relatable. So, after all of that, what do I rate the book? I've gone over a lot of negative stuff, I've gone over a lot of positive stuff, and ultimately it's all going to meld together to a middling rating of 5.5 out of 10, which, considering how much I personally find bad writing to be distracting, I think is quite a good rating. If it had been written well, I could see it being more of a maybe 7.5 out of 10 thereabouts. It's a little bit hard to say because, like I said, it was such a distracting thing as I was going through the whole book. But it did very much connect to me in terms of the themes it was covering. It really had some very interesting things to say about war and about the role of women in society, which I didn't even get into. So yeah, from a story perspective, it was very good, and I could certainly recommend it if the writing aspect of it is something that wouldn't bother you too much. It is a little bit hard to know how to recommend this book or not, but I think hopefully I've given you enough information so that you will know if it's the type of thing you would enjoy or not. And now tell me about you and what you've been reading lately. I always want to know what you've been reading, what books have maybe caught your eye that you want to read. Please do let me know in the comments, and thank you so much for watching. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video. That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers. It was not... I am going to just before I dive into the and our main character is sort of an upper class. He knows I am his servant. He knows I am his servant, Mr. Dorthwaite. Only if you anyway, and he will but before I do, because I always personally like